This is really exciting. I've been to a few conferences, but I've never been on this side. I've always been over there sitting. So this is a new experience. This is a Security Loves Dev talk. Let me introduce myself. I am a software engineer at Dockley. I do kind of, I don't like the word full stack developer, but that's kind of what I am still. Although I do most of what I do is still on the client side, where security is of course quite relevant. I live with one human, one cat, and one sourdough. Now some people will tell you stories about their sourdough. It's hundreds and hundreds of years old. It's from some rustic village in the deepest forests of France. I got my sourdough at the supermarket. I still love it. I do bake a lot. I feel like baking has a lot of similarities to development. They say that cooking is an art, while baking is a science. And it makes a lot of sense because you're given the same inputs, you're always going to get the same outputs. But compared to development, at least you can eat what you build. Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun, I think.
So I am the other half. I have the security of our Security Loves Development talk. My name is Siren. This is the second time I'm here at DevOps in London. And I already have a fan here, so no pressure for me. So thanks for that. I said I wouldn't pick on you, and I immediately start by picking on you. I'm sorry. I am the head of security at Dockley. I like ponies a lot. So if you've ever seen me present, I always have ponies in my talk. So this is my self-identified pony talk. You can follow me at SecurityPony on Twitter. I get a fair bit of questions, and my personal passion project is to try and get more people involved in security because most people don't understand my area, and security freaks them out. So I always do this by a show of hands, just my own personal poll. Who in here works with security? Hand up. So I'm going to say with a total mathematicalness of like a fourth of you, roughly. I'm going to go with a fourth. And second poll of this talk, how many people know they should probably work with security or know something about security? I'm going to go with like a half. Wow. Usually it's like everyone, and this is the first time it's smelling a half, and I would just love to interview some of you after this to see why. Just personal interest. Anyway, so I would describe myself as a security enthusiast. I've been working with security since forever. It's the only thing I do. And so, like I said, I try and get more people involved in security, and so this talk is specifically geared for that. This talk is one that was born of frustration. I work with security people, and I work with developers, and then I go to security conferences, and they all tend to have this similar theme. There's a security person or a pen tester that's standing up and demonstrating a bug that he or she has found. And he or she demonstrates this amazing exploit. And he or she just lambasts the company or the developer or the technique, whatever it happens to be, that is the genesis of this particular bug. And what I do is I watch the audience while this person is talking. Because the audience, you can always tell the difference. There's the pen testers that are sitting edge of their seats because they're going to try and use this bug to make money. Bug bounties are big bucks. And then there's the developers. And they're split into exactly two categories. There's the category which is far larger, which is I don't use this language, I don't use that library, I don't build in that particular way, and my personal all-time favorite, I personally would never make that mistake. And those people don't listen. They watch for a little bit, and they kind of nod, and I can kind of see their brains going, great, and they leave the talk. And I've asked, because I like polling and I'm interested in people, what did you take away from that talk? Like, how are you going to apply what you just saw at work? And I've never had a good answer to that question. And it's frustrating to me because then I go to conferences and I talk to people and they're like, I know I should work with security, so I go to security conferences and I didn't learn anything. Like I don't use Kali Linux. I don't work with SQL. I don't, whatever the case may be. And so they can't do anything. And then their security department shows up, and unfortunately, my people tend to be kind of jerks. And they beat the hell out of their poor developers for not knowing. And it breaks my heart because we have in IT, in security, in technology right now, it's super important to work with security because, everyone says so. Read any newspaper, talk to any boss. It is a buzzword. Add it to your CV and your salary will actually significantly rise. Fun fact. And 9 out of 10 positions in security are currently unoccupied. So it's a lucrative field. But interestingly, it's a lucrative field that we should all work with, but the tools to actually start aren't really there. And if you try and get into the security field, it's basically the equivalent of running into a concrete wall. It is incredibly difficult to get into. And I'm not selling this well, but this is the honest truth. And security has made a piss poor job of trying to get more people involved, from my perspective. Maybe you disagree, but you're here to listen to me, so go me. So, and this is something that frustrates me a lot, and it's frustrated me for a very long time. And so one day at work, I was sitting in our coffee break room, sulking over a cup of coffee, frankly, because I'd just been to a user group where the developer core was sitting and basically just vomiting all over their security department because they were trying to do things better, and their security department was not meeting them halfway. Their security department consisted of the word no. And I was really, I just kind of felt hopeless in that situation. I was depressed. And so I was sulking over a cup of coffee, and I have the great, great fortune to work with people that put up with my sulking and my bitching. And so I was describing this particular problem to a workmate who pointed out the fact that there are no talks between security and development on the same stage, where it's usually security stands and makes a bunch of statements, and then the developers in the audience sit and either are like, dudess is full of shit, or it's security, or forgive me, development that stands and makes a bunch of statements, and security sits in the back because we're cool with our ski mask, and just kind of says no from a distance, and then we leave. And the gap between those two departments is one that's really, really difficult to bridge. And so we started talking about this, and we realized that this is something that was lacking. And so it is my enormous privilege to stand here before you today with that particular colleague who had this brilliant particular idea, because I credit this idea to her completely. And I think this is important from two perspectives. One, it really highlights the fact that the security department is not solely responsible for security. I am enormously blessed to work with developers that are brilliant and kind and empathetic and willing to listen to me bitch. And two, I have done this for long enough to realize that I don't know everything, thank God. And so it needs to be a give and take in relationship. And through this talk, I'm hoping that we can highlight a few key points that can kind of help to bridge that gap. So I give it over to my dear colleague.
Thank you. So that's why I'm here, to take credit for this talk. And I will spend the rest of it just standing here, smiling, nodding. But I guess as long as I'm up here, I can shamelessly pretend to speak for all developers and give, the other side of the story. I feel like security is really straightforward in principle. In principle, you have all these amazing abbreviations that are so easy to remember, like XSS and CSRF, etc. And each of them is very clearly defined in some abstract way in these amazing documents like OWASP, etc. There's, you can find a lot of information about it. But at some point, you also have to convert it into practical experience. You have to look at your own code base and, would you actually be able to find SQL injections there based on this abstract document that you read? Although maybe SQL injections themselves are kind of a naive example. Thank you.
Security.
So much easier to read now. Why don't developers generally find all these vulnerabilities? Why do the vulnerabilities keep showing up in the wild? And I have a theory. My developer theory. I think that developers are just plainly too good at what we do. What we do is we take some kind of need and we convert it into a feature, a product. We're really, really good at building things. And we always strive to build things that work. And that's the problem. Things are not always supposed to work. The endpoint that hands out user information isn't always supposed to just gladly hand out information to anyone that asks for it. There's supposed to be limitations. The system is supposed to say no. And although I think everyone understands that in principle, that's not the focus of the developer. We build things. We build things that work. We're really good at it. And we focus maybe a bit too much on the happy path.
So, a bit of an agenda for this particular talk. I wanted to just start out by really focusing on my key principle is that security loves you, and that if you are a developer, I love you, and that developers deserve security people that love them. And if you don't have that, that is the security person's fault. So that is from me to you. We're going to talk a little bit about what a risk is, specifically, because security is all about handling risks. And then there's some concrete things that we can make different. I'm going to talk a little bit about the CIA triangle, or we are, forgive me. There's two of us here. We're going to talk a little bit about least privilege, sensitive action checking, and finally some threat modeling. So those are all some concrete things that we can do better. And why do I want concrete things that we can do better? Because security, and I'm now grossly speaking for all security people, no pressure, we can be a little bit, shall we say, inconcrete. What is a risk? And, it doesn't matter if I can say it can happen someday. That's not a concrete thing. Security tends to focus on either ooga booga booga, the bad man is coming to get you, the bad woman is coming to get you, anonymous is coming to get you, or fill out this document. And neither one of those, from a development perspective, are particularly interesting. And I can say that as a security person, but not a developer. But Johanna has told me with great enthusiasm, documentation does not make a good developer happy. I don't know if there's any developers in here that love documentation, but I'm going to say from all of my experience, I've never met one. So if there's any developer in here that feels that they're that person, then kindly wave a limb. Oh, wow, you're waving a limb. Really?
I love document.
Are you looking for a job? Security may be the field for you. Just going to come out and say it. Really? Well, that's why. I also love documentation. So it's you and me. We're like this. Welcome. I hope I don't rip on our people too much. I hope. I'm trying to make things better, so feel free to disagree. So if we look at risk, we can look at it from three perspectives, and we generally do in security. And their impact, possibility, and ease of exploitation. And I show this slide a lot, and people immediately go to impact, because that's the concrete one. They're like, what is the impact if this happens? And that's the sexy one to look at, because that's the concrete, I'm going to do something. And that's generally what developers like to do. They like to do something. And I'm going to ask you to not directly go to that one. Instead, I want you to look at the possibility. And this is the crystal ball fluffy one. And this is where security tends to be a bit fluffy. Because what is the likelihood that someone is going to hack your application tomorrow? No one can honestly, hand to your heart, hand to God, hand on a computer, hand on a hard drive, say that that is actually going to happen. Unless someone calls you on the phone and is like, hey, my name is Mr. Crime, I'm hacking you tomorrow. Then it's different. But generally speaking, it's a crystal ball. It's a really, if you're lucky, it's an educated guess. And most people don't like to make educated guesses, because educated guesses, if you're wrong, can cost a company money, and that's not a fun conversation to have. But we can look at possibility in a more concrete manner, because there are tools that can help us guess possibility. We can look at things like OWASP and SANS and CVSS, who actually do poll the internet every single year to see how often bugs occur, and can say that there is a trend for this particular type of attack. So they can give you trends. You can look at coding standards and see trends. So possibility is always going to be the fluffy one, and it's the one that people tend to ignore. And then there's ease of exploitation, which is also difficult, because now you have to say, how likely is it that someone else can do this? And it's the someone else, because you're not trying to secure a risk that I know I am not going to hack my own database. Done. I know that would be really difficult or really easy. But how can we say that for somebody else? And this is where you tend to get tripped up again, because you look from your own particular experience. I think it would be really difficult. Next person could be a way better hacker, developer, whatever than I am. Is it really difficult for them? No. And so rather than looking directly at impact, it's important that we focus on those two first, because they're the fluffy, crappy ones, and we can have impact as a sort of reward. And impact is, how bad is it going to be if this actually happens? The nice thing is that you can assign these a score. So you can go 1 to 5. If it's 1 being super unlikely and 5 being super likely, if it's a possibility, 1. Ease of exploitation, 5. And the impact is a 1, that's probably not where you want to start your security journey. So you can actually start ranking these to give yourself an idea of the risk category that you're looking at. So taking something that can be super fluffy, how likely is this going to happen tomorrow, into a concrete step that everyone can actually touch and grab. Now, the gentleman that's seen me talk once before is going to know that I always say this. This is the most important slide, right? I said this last time. This is the most important slide I ever show. He's nodding to agree. And I always say that, and everyone nods and smiles, just like the gentleman right there is doing. And then they forget it, which I'm pretty sure the gentleman right there did, because he's looking guilty now. So I totally am picking on you again. I'm sorry. So this is InfoSec at its very core. It is 3 concepts. It is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. How secret does the information need to be? How important is it that the information is correct? And when do you need the information? It is not important the triangle is spelled correctly, mostly because I cannot spell.
I wondered if you were sending a message.
It is a very subliminal message. I am good at many things, but spelling is not one of them.
It is spelled correctly. It's just in Swedish.
Oh, ooh, good save! High five. Woo! Oh my God, yes, it's a subliminal message that my guest speaker is Swedish. Yeah, I wanted to highlight her Swedishness. Oh my God. Okay, so thank you for that, by the way. But this is the most important slide, because you can break down any InfoSec possibility into these 3 core components. And what's nice about this is this gives you another tangible thing you can actually touch. Because if you're looking at development, you're like, it is super important that this private key stay private. Pretty, you know. You can actually do confidentiality plus private key, and then look on security Stack Overflow. And then copy paste just like you do for any other development problem. Security Stack Overflow exists. You can copy paste from it just like you do from, no one would ever copy paste from Stack Overflow. But if you're that person, it exists and you can copy paste.
All right, so I think when it comes to risks, it's something that everyone thinks about. And I think the developers obviously think a lot about risks. It's just that it's different risks that might be in focus. If you're building client-side applications, then you know that there's this magic number of latency. If you go over it, users start feeling that your application is laggy, slow, might not be working, and users very, very quickly lose interest in an application that's too slow. And that's a huge risk. Another common risk is maintainability. Is your code, is it bad? Is it unnecessarily complex, or is it just really complex? As you add complexity, obviously you're also adding development time, you're adding documentation time, you're adding time required to maintain it, to build on it, and I think developers are also very lazy at heart, so I think this one is really important for us. We do think about security, but sometimes it just gets lumped into the whole, well, it's HTTPS, so it's fine. It's encrypted. You'd have to break HTTPS to do anything, right? And then finally, there's, I think, maybe the biggest risk that developers think about, and that is deadlines. And this is a picture of my boss, very unconvincingly pretending to care about deadlines. I asked her to, and this was the best she could muster. I think that if you, and this is more of a guess, because I don't really have any numbers for it, but if you look at the actual vulnerabilities you find in the wild, a large number of them are going to come down to deadlines. And deadlines can be both sort of artificial, it's management said that it has to be done, or they can be more real. Maybe your application has a certain time window during which it has to be released, or you missed your chance, and the company, is gone, and you don't have a job. So that's a really hard limit. It pushes you, and you have to make those prioritizations. So there's a lot of risks to think about.
I love this picture. Her name is Sila, and she's the head of R&D, and so she is my counterpart. And what's really funny about this photo is this is her angry face. This is her angry face. She's like the most cheerful, sweet person I know. And what's an interesting perspective on risk is that Sila's job is to get things out with quality as quickly as possible, whereas my job is to try and keep things safe, which is slower. And so I have the great fortune to work with Sila, and we have a very good dynamic relation, which is give and take. And one of our success factors is that when I come to Sila with a risk, I'm very concrete about it. I think it's, this likely. Now, Sila, her job is to always be like, no, nope, no. Because that's her job. She wants to get things out as fast as possible. But the more concrete I am, the easier for her it is to say yes. And sometimes this can be really frustrating for me because it's like, I know it's going to happen, but I can't prove it. And Sila, to her great privilege, or not privilege, it's my privilege, but one of the things that makes her so good at her job is that her ability to listen and actually hear that, even if she emotionally disagrees with me. Whereas I have to be very concrete about what I want. She has to be willing to listen. And like I said, great thing about her is she does. And that this is her angry face. I love this picture of her because I think it describes our work really well. Everyone's pretty cheerful at where we work. So total side note on great place to work. Least privilege. This is one that you hear about a lot, and it's going to come up even more. So unfortunately, this is probably where your security department is going to be like, yes, I have a law, because in GDPR, it talks a lot about least privilege. So there's going to be a lot of shrill shrieking from security that have read the GDPR law. And if you haven't read it, it's actually very interesting because it talks a lot about privacy by design and making sure that least privilege is a concept that is respected. But what does that actually mean? Because it's an easy thing to say. Your application should run with least privilege. You can't end the sentence with that. That is not a sentence, that is half a sentence. But unfortunately, in security, we tend to talk a lot about least privilege. Well, what does it mean actually? Because the least privilege means what? I want to make sure that the least amount of developers can get at a sensitive piece of information. That's least privilege. Okay, so I'm going to say it's 5 developers. Is it 50 developers? Is it 500,000? What is the least number? And now we're immediately into fuzzy territory. Because what does that tangibly mean? And the GDPR doesn't say the number is 6. 6 developers is okay. 7, it's the giant fines. So then I immediately get, okay, well, I'm going to try and calculate something. What can I calculate it based on? So then we get back to risk. So then I bring up the little risk chart that I showed 3 slides ago, something like that. And so we start looking at risk again. We break it down. What is the possibility that my 5 developers are competent? High. Okay, good. What is the ease of exploitation that they, screw something up? Well, they're all competent, so I'd say it's pretty low. Okay, good. But what is the impact if they screw it up? And this is where it becomes a much less fun conversation for me to have because I have to go to someone and be like, well, I don't trust our people. Therefore, and that's not the tack I should take. And unfortunately, that is the tack that security tends to take. We tend to take it from a negative aspect. We tend to take it from, we have to restrict it because a law, GDPR in this case, says so, or NIST, or SANS, critical controls say so, et cetera, et cetera. So we have lots of laws that we can point to. But if we are the person constantly saying no because, I can guarantee that we will be the person that is avoided like some sort of horrible plague. So we're going to go back to my 5 developers. My 5 developers work 23 hours a day, always. They can't take any vacation because there's 5 of them. Could I turn that conversation to, I want to make sure I have a good place to work, so I want to make sure that we have the ability to let our developers relax? The mindfulness keynote that came up, good idea, relaxing. I don't have the, meditation pose, but can you instead turn that conversation to least privilege needs to be so that we can have a sustainable and manageable workplace? That's a much better argument to have. Could we instead turn that conversation to we want to make sure that our developers have the competency, the ability, and the skill to maintain and build this in a safe and secure manner? Much easier conversation to have. But why? Well, no, I'm not going to go with that one instead. We're going to turn the conversation to protect the data and to protect our people. So rather than making it a conversation of, I say the law says, I'm still making the same point. I'm arguing that the least amount of people, the least amount of APIs, the least amount of whatever it is, has access to whatever it is. But rather from a focus of, no, you can't do that, I'm turning it into a yes, but, which is a much easier conversation to have. And it comes back to risk. You have to look at it from a company perspective and from an information perspective. What is the risk that this is going to happen? And if you have 5 developers working 23 hours a day, never taking vacation, the risk is super high.
So the principle of least privilege is a really nice principle. And as principles and abstract things tend to be, they're a bit harder in real life. I think that it goes down to the fact that if you want to be able to limit, say for a piece of code or a service or a role in a company, you want to limit the information they're able to access, the actions they're able to perform. You also need to have either have a system that has that type of granularity, or you have to build that system. Either case, what you're doing is you're adding complexity, you're adding a rigidness to your system. And very often, the things you're building, the specification you get, is not going to be the same when you start building it as it's going to be when you are done, or when you continue working on it, because things never get done. The specification just keeps changing. The more you expect this least privilege, the more you expect that, the less room you have to change the specification. I think there needs to be an expectation on the people that write the specification that the more specific they want to be, the less they're also allowed to change their minds after a while, I think. It's not that we, as developers, don't care. It's just that this is not an ideal world. We have to be able to build something. Right? No, okay.
So I've been told that I'm never, ever allowed to change my mind, which works super well because we're working in an agile workplace. So never changing my mind is going to work out great for me. Sensitive action check. This is an ugly slide, and I know it's an ugly slide, and I apologize for its ugliness. But I have presented you with the way things work a shocking amount of times. The user takes an action through the UI. He or she, or they, push a button. Some code executes. You'll notice that I am not a developer because I've just written some code executes. If this was a developer, it would be very specific. So I've just written some. Something else happens, an authentication or an authorization has happened, and then the business logic kapow does something. Very non-specific. I am not a developer. This is the best I can do. This is the way it's supposed to happen. Unfortunately, I, the user, take the exact same action, but I do it via a proxy. I do almost all of my work via a proxy. I avoid the authentication completely, and kapow, the business logic executes. Now, I'm seeing on the faces of some of you that this would never, ever, ever happen. because you would never, ever, ever, ever do that. And I'm just going to ask you to put that thought aside just a teeny tiny bit, because I've never seen a system where this isn't true, ever. There is always some service that doesn't check. The way it's supposed to work and the way you're imagining that it always works is this. Some user takes an action. All code must pass through the exact same authentication module. And then the kapow business logic happens. Kapow. Now, what's interesting about this example is that everyone thinks that their system works in this way. They all think their system works in this way. So I want to take an example with you and I. You as an audience, me as a person. So you and I work for a company. And if an action takes place, we earn nothing. Unless the action is taken by person X. If person X is the only person that is able to execute the action, we earn $1 million. $1 million, each of us. It's a lot of money, unless you're, independently wealthy. But for me, it's a lot of money. I can guarantee that you and I would sit down and go through every single action in every single micro nanometer of that code base to make sure that every single action in that system called authentication, to make sure, one, it was person X or it wasn't, and that the action was permitted. Yes? Because we all want $1 million, right? Or maybe you don't. I do. Because I like to eat and I, want to be independently wealthy because it seems cool. But that's not the way it actually works in a utopian society. No one has ever offered me $1 million to check one thing, unfortunately. And code bases are really, really large. But security always says that this is the way it's supposed to work. Check it every single time. Now you run microservices. And you have a bunch of different users. And you have a testing department. And you have a bunch of integrations to everything. What is the likelihood, what is the risk that that is actually going to happen? And now I'm not allowed to change my mind either. Great. Thanks for that one.
So let's talk about the $1 million. Where do I sign up? Where do I get this? I actually want to go back 2 slides. I think that this is obviously made by a security expert.
Hey.
I'm not speaking about the incredible design work. What I mean is the code part is very small and all the security parts are very big. If a developer made this, you'd have the code all over the screen, and then maybe on the edges you'd have some arrows somewhere. And that shows a different perspective. Maybe it's a lot harder to see those green arrows when you have to look at the entire code base. And I think that's the difference between the $1 million example, obviously, is that you don't build one web page one time with one action that you have to worry about. You build countless web pages, and you just keep building them. And every web page has countless actions. And checking every single one and never missing anything is not an easy thing to do. If the number is just big enough, you're going to miss something. So the way to work with it is maybe have processes where you actually don't just do it alone. Obviously, you want a code review, but maybe make security checks part of the code review. The more eyes you have, the easier it gets. And some eyes are better than others. Go back to the developer theory. We're really good at building things that work. We forget the part where it's not supposed to work. We forget that we know exactly how the system is supposed to work, so we know the inputs and what they're supposed to look like. But the first thing a tester or a security person will do is put in the wrong thing into the system, and it will break. And another trick might be to maybe find the things that are the most vulnerable, or where the risk is the greatest, where the problems, if something happens, is the greatest, and prioritize. Look at those things first, make it a continuous effort, but focus first on the things that are most important to you.
So how do you do that concretely? You can use something called threat modeling. And so Threat modeling is something that looks really fancy. So if you want to impress someone, you can draw a threat model. Since so few people know what security is, this looks super cool because you can draw it and you can make it in beautiful colors and they can show it to people and they will be impressed. That, or you can just have running code. Those are my two, like, I'm going to look cool things. It's threat modeling, and then I have a matrix, like, screensaver. And people think I'm cool because that's important to me. Threat modeling is probably the strongest tool that I can give my developers and that I can teach my developers to help them find risks. And threat modeling is something that we do all of the time. But we don't do it like this. If you have a very expensive car, do you park next to the car that's all dinged up and that has obviously driven into a pole 18 times and is backed up into a lot of stuff? If you drive a Lexus, you do not. If you have no insurance on your car, you probably drive in a more risk-filled, careful way than you do if you are independently wealthy with my $1 million example. You'd just be like, whatever, I'll just buy myself a new car. Off I go, vroom. So this is something we do all of the time. We make threat models in our head all of the time. If you're walking home by yourself and there's like one street where there's like a serial killer at the end with an axe, and then the other street has been drawn by Disney, which one do you pick? Me, I'm going Disney. But it's something that we do all of the time, and I would argue that developers do this all of the time as well. They just don't document it, apart from you and I, because we're awesome. But you walk around most developer people, and there's usually a whiteboard or a Post-it, or they have this in their head. And this is drawing the system. So this is just a simple system. It's a little library database and a little servlet, a login process, some users, and some database files. And this is how they talk to each other. And every single developer can do this to some extent. You know what your item talks to. You might not be able to draw the entire flow, but you know that it talks to something, and you know what that thing should be. Yes? Nod? Or no? I have no clue. I just began banging away at work, and then I'm done. I'm just going to assume that you do. So you can draw out a system like this, and then you add these nice little red lines. This one and this one. And those are called your threat boundaries. And that's when your data goes from... Ooh. That was weird. That's when your data goes from you to an untrusted source. And if you're new to security, that is the area you want to focus in. So if you've never worked with security and you're sitting there and your boss, Sila, the angry lady of a few slides ago, has told you, you must add security this sprint. I have dedicated 10% of our development time to security. Do something secure. And if you look at most specs, that is what they have. It's do something security-ish. It's important. I've seen the specs. They're depressing. So you're sitting there at your desk. You're supposed to, begin somewhere. And you're like, all right, well, where do I begin? And this is a tool that everyone can use because everyone has a pen and paper, a whiteboard, Post-it note, whatever it is. And so you can draw out your little thing. So you're making the servlet there. That is your portion. The login request and the login response go through a red line. How do you secure that connection? That's your first question. How do you secure that connection? Hopefully you're saying HTTPS TLS. If it's HTTP, you and I should definitely have a talk. Just, me to you. HTTPS TLS, it's your thing. So you actually check, is it actually there? Yes. If it's not, build it. If it is, but no one's ever checked the version, or the version is so out of date that it's no longer secure, you can update it. That is a concrete thing you can do to improve your security. And then you have the user. And if you're a classic security shrill idiot, you're going to say that no one should trust the user. They're all terrible people. And that's not necessarily true. Users are good people. I like them. I am a user. My mom is a user, and I like my mom. But my mom is a terrible computer person. She is capable of crashing the best web server because she puts all of her information into one field, and then she pushes enter. And there's nothing wrong with my mom, and she's done this forever, despite the fact that I'm her daughter. And she can crash almost anything just because she's so terrible at using a computer. And so when you're looking at a user, you can look at the input that I'm getting from that user. Do I actually validate it? Do I name type it? How much input am I expecting? And the most important question, what do I do if that input is unexpected? Stack tracing, dumping out all of your secret, keys, etc., is not a good response to unexpected input, and it's shockingly common because we're looking at the happy flow. The user is always going to be, computer user X, who is always going to fill this in exactly correctly, and so we don't take the negative case into account. And threat modeling is a tool that you can use if you have no idea where to even start. You go to CIA triangle, which half of you have already forgotten. You look at that red line, you bust out your little triangle. See? Guilty face. Sorry, no, I'm picking on someone else now. But he had the best guilty face ever. It was just perfect. I'm sorry. That was amazing. Because your entire face was just like... And you can look at it, and you're like, okay, so I have this data flow. That thing is just really wobbly. And what is the most important from a security perspective of this red line? Is it confidentiality? I should look at that. Is it integrity? I should look at that. Or is it availability? If it's availability, you're going to look at you're going to look at load balancing. If it's integrity, you're going to look at tampering protection. If it's confidentiality, you're going to sit on crypto super hard. But that's a good place to start your Google journey. And all you need is a pen and paper and some red ink.
So again, I'm going to just pretend to speak for all developers and say that one thing we might struggle with threat modeling is that our job is to solve things using technical solutions. It's what we do. So when we're faced with a problem like threat modeling, where we're supposed to look at something and just say whether or not it is a threat, we tend to just look at the solution. So maybe if our dear colleague points out that this endpoint is actually not CSRF protected, why did we forget this one? We might just say that it's fine, it's HTTPS. While in fact the problem or the what you're doing when you're doing threat modeling is not a question of saying, well, it's not a problem, that's not a problem, that's not a problem, that's not going to happen, that's never going to happen. What you're supposed to do is just go through each and every one and document it. Write something. Maybe the actual risk of it happening, that might be low. It should still be documented. Don't just jump to the solution. I think developers are very solution-minded. You know that time when your friend is telling you about that problem they had, and then you were obviously tried to solve it for them. You gave them a perfect solution for this problem, and they got mad. It's because they didn't actually want you to solve their problem. They just wanted to tell you about their troubles. So you have to work on turning that off. And it goes for threat modeling too. And that's a recurring theme. Developers have certain things we're really good at, but sometimes you have to widen your perspective, open it up a bit, and make use of your perfect security colleagues.
I'm not perfect.
Well, imperfect security colleagues.
There we go.
Yeah. I'm actually missing my last notes. So I think that in closing, what I want to say is try to keep an open mind. I know that security people are super annoying and make unreasonable demands all the time.
It's totally true. We do.
But they're not really. They're nice when you get to know them, when you learn to speak to them.
Thanks.
And some of them are really, really good at not just yelling at you or ordering you. Some of them actually make the effort to speak to you as a person, but to actually explain why it's a problem. Not just say, look here, there's this documentation, here's CSV or something. That's not very conducive to motivate you. Some of them will actually take the effort to show you, here, look, there's a problem. This the lack of CSRF protection means that, say, the user has an infected plugin in their browser. Now, HTTPS is not the only answer. Now, that makes the developer actually, maybe you remember that the next time you're building something. Maybe you actually think about security the next time you're working. You become a slightly better, more security conscious developer. And that's a really good thing.
So we've written some takeaways together that I hope you can take from this particular talk. The first one is that there are some forbidden words. And I think this is important because when you're having that first conversation, I think there's some things that should never, ever be said. And the first one is from the security perspective. I am never, ever, ever, ever permitted, and I'm speaking for all security people now, because security says so. That is not a reason. I can say lots of things, but I could be wrong, and that happens far, far more often than I would like to admit. And it's also not a tangible thing. Because security says so is not a reason. Developers, and Johanna says I'm allowed to say this, so I have her as a reference point, are not allowed to say, but why? And it will never happen in like the whiny tone of voice that just... And so if you can put those two statements to the side, you're actually going to have a better conversation. But that means that you have to push back on security because a lot of us are used to a very comfortable position of being able to say because we say so. Or now because GDPR says so. And because most people haven't actually read the law, it's an easy thing to say. Because I know that most of you haven't read it. I have. So I can just be like, yeah, it's on page 64. And I know that you're not going to check page 64. So push me. Push me and push me and push me until I have a good answer. And if I can't give you a good answer, force me to Google it or to find you someone who can answer the question. But that I can push back on you, and you have to be able to listen. If you're not willing to actually hear me, it's a give and take relationship. And standards come into this a lot, and standards get a lot of flack because, ISO, ugh. But standards exist for a reason. And sometimes the reason can be, it's an ISO thing. ISO says we have to do it. I'm not a huge fan either. But that's the way it is. We all have to clean the bathroom. ISO says so. There we go. And hopefully we can all just suck it up. Open-mindedness has never actually killed anyone. I hope. We hope. Being able to have a conversation with your security person, being able to have a conversation with your developer in an open-minded way is not going to kill you. And if that person is a jerk, and a lot of security people are, I can only apologize on behalf of our people because you deserve better. And I started this talk with that we love you, and our function is one of support. I am a supporting function. I am not the key function. My job is to help my developers to do their jobs better. No one wants to buy a security product that is made by security because it would be a foil hat in a cave in the dark with the man in black standing outside, like zapping you. Like that would be the secure solution and no one could use it. And security tends to forget this. We are a supporting function. We are not the function. And finally, this one is said a lot, but I'm going to say it a lot as well, is we work best if we work together. Silos help nobody. And if security and developers can learn to kind of at least meet in the middle slightly better, I would argue that we will have a better and a stronger product. So that was our talk. We have like 30 seconds for questions, but we'll be sticking around if you have more questions. But from us, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned that one of the problems that you experience, or you have experienced quite a lot, is that security people find it hard to think in concrete ways, and developers often don't think about the sad path instead of the happy path. I was wondering if you've ever seen these or tried to use something like behavior-driven development, where you can write a specification for security rather than business, and then turn that into a workable test. So say if I send 20 million characters in the description field, the server shouldn't dump out everything or something like that. Have you ever tried it?
Of course we write. I mean, of course I write security requirements all of the time. And I hope your security department does. I mean, if they don't, they should. From me to you. There should always be security requirements of, if this happens, this should be the response. But you quickly run into either a deadline, in my experience, or the argument of that would never happen. But yes, that is absolutely the ideal way of working.
There's also a tendency that security requirements come after. First you build it, then you add the security requirements, which makes it harder to build.
Yes.
Yeah.
But good question.
Really good question.
Any other questions? Yeah?
Does this mean that the security person should be in a part of the team when we developing? Like we have testers, developers, we talking together. Should be the security as well?
I would argue that in the best of worlds, the security person should be such a natural part of the team that it's difficult to say who is security and who's not. That is the utopian setting. Unfortunately, security has a tendency to try and remove themselves, either because they're not invited or they're too cool. But I would argue that the more you can get your security to sit with your developers, offer cookies, cakes, coffee, the better that relationship is, the more likely it becomes a natural part of the development process. So yeah.
What I see is even though you have a security requirements, when it comes to development or develop something, nobody looks at that. Only when somebody is reviewing the code, that time he will go and review what is there in the security, and does this code follow those norms and ensures the code is secure, but not when it is actually being developed.
I would argue that the further we can push left in the security process, the better. So if you have developers that are security aware, I mean, they'll come and talk to you and say, hey, I did a risk assessment in my head, and this is kind of my thinking. This is what I should build. What do you think? Then you're going to have security added before they even start coding. But that means that the security person has to be the type of person that is approachable. Because no developer wants to, come and talk to someone that's immediately just like, you're stupid. But if you have the type of security department that welcomes that type of involvement, the result is more secure code. But again, it's on the security department to make themselves approachable. And so you have to push them to force that in. You have to force them, security, to be that person. And if they are the department of no, then I would say it's a really difficult problem to solve in a positive way.
It comes back to what I said about security people who actually take the effort to explain what they mean and to engage developers in the security work also means that you get security from the ground up. That's the goal, at least.
Yes. More questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.